One arrow changed the world forever. October 14th, 1066. King Harold of England stood triumphant. He'd just crushed the greatest Viking invasion in history. But across the channel, another enemy was landing. William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, had come to claim what he believed was rightfully his. On a blood-soaked field at Hastings, two civilizations collided. Saxon axes met Norman cavalry in the most decisive battle in English history. When a single arrow found Harold's eye, 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon rule died with him. This is the story of how Viking raiders became French nobles, then conquered England, transforming medieval Europe forever. The longships appeared through morning mist like ghosts given flesh and purpose, their dragon prows cutting the dark waters of the Seine as they had for generations before. Behind carved figureheads that snarled at Christian shores, warriors pulled their oars in rhythm older than memory, each stroke carrying them deeper into the heart of Francia. The year was 910, and the Northmen had come again to harvest what the Franks had sown. At the head of this latest fleet stood a giant among giants, a warrior whose very name would reshape the map of Europe. The Vikings called him Hrolf the Walker, so massive that no horse could bear his weight, forcing him to stride into battle on foot while lesser men rode. The Franks would know him as Rollo, and his descendants would one day conquer kingdoms. But on this grey morning, as his ships rounded the bend toward Rouen, he was simply another sea king, seeking plunder in a land grown rich from decades of peace. Through the reedy marshlands of the Seine Valley, smoke already rose from burning villages. The raider crews had been busy through the night, their iron doing the work that words could not. Livestock lowed in captured herds, while frightened peasants stumbled along in chains, their former lives reduced to ash and memory. This was the Viking way: swift, brutal, efficient. Take what could be carried, burn what could not, and leave the survivors to remember why the North was feared. From the ramparts of Rouen, Frankish defenders watched the approaching doom with the resignation of men who had seen this dance performed too many times before. The fortress walls stood strong, built from Roman stone that had weathered centuries of storm and siege. But stone alone had never been enough to stop the sea wolves when they came in such numbers. Count after count had fallen to their axes, and each summer brought fresh fleets up the river highways that connected the Viking homeland to Christian gold. Like wolves sensing weakness, the Northmen had learned to read the pulse of Frankish politics with predator instincts. King Charles ruled from distant Laon, his authority fragmented among nobles who owed him lip service but little else. The great Carolingian Empire that once stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe had crumbled into warring duchies, each lord more concerned with his neighbour's ambitions than with raiders from the northern seas. Into this chaos stepped men like the giant who now beached his ships on Seine mud and began arranging his warriors for assault. No horse in Francia could carry his bulk, but Rollo needed no mount to inspire fear in enemy hearts. Standing head and shoulders above his own champions, wrapped in mail that gleamed like silver scales and carrying an axe that most men could barely lift, he moved through his battle line like a king among wolves. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of one who had never known defeat, and his grey eyes held the cold light of northern skies, where mercy froze before it could take root. Year after year, the pattern had been the same: Viking fleets ascending French rivers like a tide of iron, fortresses falling to siege and storm, desperate kings buying peace with Danegeld that only encouraged fresh raids the following season. The Great Siege of Paris 25 years earlier had shown both the raiders' power and their price. Count Odo had held the city's walls, while the Northmen camped outside like a plague made flesh. and when King Charles finally paid them to leave, everyone knew they would return with greater appetites. When the harvest moon rose full over the Seine Valley in September of 910, Rollo's warriors prepared for what they assumed would be another profitable campaign. They had taken Bayeux by storm, scattered the forces of Count Berengar, and now Rouen walls beckoned with promise of greater plunder. But as the Norseman sharpened his great axe and planned his assault, forces beyond his knowledge were gathering to change his destiny forever. Beneath dragon banners that snapped in the autumn wind, the sea wolves made their final preparations for assault. Veterans of 100 raids checked weapons and armor, with the casual efficiency of men who had turned slaughter into art. Younger warriors, eager for their first taste of Frankish gold, boasted of the deeds they would perform when the walls fell. None suspected that this siege would be their last as raiders, that the giant who led them stood at the threshold of transformation, from destroyer to builder. The Frankish garrison within Rouen walls knew their situation bordered on hopeless. Count Robert of Neustria had withdrawn with the bulk of his forces, leaving behind only enough men to make a symbolic defense. The townspeople huddled in their houses like sheep awaiting slaughter, while priests intoned prayers that seemed to vanish like smoke in the face of approaching doom. Yet in distant Lyon, King Charles was making calculations that would turn this siege into the pivot point of history. Through the darkness before dawn, Rollo moved among his warriors with the quiet confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. His presence alone was worth a dozen siege engines. Where the walker strode, men followed, and walls fell before the fury he unleashed. The attack would begin with first light, and by evening, Rouen would burn like all the other towns that had dared resist the Viking tide. But when sunrise painted the Seine, valley gold, and the horns of war began to sound, neither the giant preparing his assault, nor the frightened defenders manning their walls could foresee how this day would reshape the destiny of France. The greatest transformation in medieval Europe was about to begin, born from the marriage of Viking strength and Frankish necessity, sealed with oaths that would echo through centuries to come, on the banks of the Epte River, chosen as neutral territory. Autumn mist curled above the surface like silent spectators to a moment that would shape the future. Two armies faced each other across the narrow stream. On one side, the flower of Frankish nobility in their finest mail, crosses gleaming on shield and banner. On the other, Viking warriors still bearing the salt stains of distant seas, their dragon standards snapping in the October wind. Between them stretched a silence heavy with the weight of decision, where the future of a kingdom hung in the balance of words yet unspoken. Across the shallow water, King Charles the Simple sat his horse with the careful dignity of a monarch who had learned that survival sometimes required swallowing pride. At 32, the Frankish ruler had inherited an empire in fragments, his authority challenged by nobles who remembered when Carolingian power stretched from ocean to ocean. Now he faced a choice that would either secure his realm or damn it, make peace with the raiders who had terrorized his people for generations, or watch his kingdom bleed to death from 1,000 cuts. Charles himself had ridden from Leon with his greatest lords, men whose faces bore the scars of too many seasons fighting the Viking tide. Count Robert of Neustria flanked his right, while Archbishop Franco of Rouen rode at his left, the cross and sword united in common cause. These were the men who would witness what chroniclers would call either wisdom or folly, the day a Christian king offered land to heathen raiders in exchange for peace. In the crisp air of that October morning, Rollo crossed the river with only a handful of his champions. leaving his warband on the far shore, like a promise of what would come if words failed. The giant moved with the easy confidence of one who had never known defeat, yet something in his grey eyes suggested he understood the magnitude of this moment. No longer was this simply another raid. This was transformation, the chance to trade the uncertainties of the sea for the solid promise of land. Like two wolves meeting at the boundary of their territories, king and Viking chief took each other's measure in that first exchange of words. Charles spoke in careful Latin, his voice carrying the authority of 15 generations of Frankish kings. The Norseman replied in his own tongue, then switched to the rough Frankish he had learned from captives and merchants. Each man knew the other held something he desperately needed: Charles, the strength to defend his realm; Rollo, the legitimacy that only a king could grant. No scribe recorded the exact words that passed between them in those first crucial moments, but the terms they negotiated would reshape the map of Europe. The king offered what no Viking had ever been granted: permanent settlement, legal lordship over vast territories, recognition as a Christian duke rather than a heathen raider. In return, the giant would bend his knee in homage, accept baptism in the Christian faith, and turn his warriors from destroyers into defenders of the very lands they had once plundered. From the Epte to the sea, from the Breslau to the Orne, Charles granted territories that encompassed some of the richest farmland in Francia. This was no empty wilderness, but settled country, with towns and villages, mills and markets, churches and monasteries. A functioning realm that needed only strong leadership to flourish. The irony was lost on none who witnessed the exchange. Lands devastated by Viking raids would now be defended by Vikings transformed into vassals. The ceremony of homage followed ancient Frankish ritual, yet nothing could make it less remarkable. Before assembled nobles who had spent their lives fighting the Northmen, Rollo knelt and placed his hands between those of the king. The words he spoke were simple: "I become your man." But their implications echoed across Europe like thunder. The age of Viking raids on Francia was ending. The age of Norman lordship had begun. Within days of the treaty's signing, the transformation began in earnest. Warriors who had lived their entire adult lives aboard longships suddenly found themselves learning the arts of land management. Viking jarls who had commanded raiding crews now studied the complexities of feudal obligation. The Norseman himself, now Duke Rollo of Normandy, established his court at Rouen and began the delicate work of melding two peoples into one. Between Norse custom and Frankish law, compromises emerged that satisfied neither tradition completely, but created something entirely new. The newcomers kept their own gods in private, while accepting Christian baptism in public. They maintained their assembly traditions while acknowledging feudal hierarchy. Most importantly, they retained their warrior culture while channeling it toward defense rather than raid. The marriage arranged between the new Duke and Gisla, daughter of Charles, sealed the political alliance with bonds of blood and kinship, though some chroniclers would later claim the bride was not truly of royal birth. Her symbolic importance remained undeniable. Through her, Viking strength wed itself to Frankish legitimacy, creating a dynasty that would reshape the medieval world. From the coastal settlements where dragon ships once beached for raids, a new nobility began to emerge. Norse jarls became Norman barons, their sons learning Latin alongside the language of their fathers. Frankish techniques of castle building merged with Viking military innovations. Most crucially, the restless energy that had driven men across dangerous seas now turned toward the systematic conquest and administration of territory. The transformation was not without its tensions and contradictions. Old Vikings grumbled about abandoning the sea for farming, while Frankish peasants watched their former tormentors become their protectors with understandable suspicion. Yet necessity drove both peoples toward accommodation. The Northmen needed local knowledge to manage their new lands effectively, while the Franks needed Norse military prowess to defend against other raiders who had not accepted such generous terms. As autumn deepened into winter along the Norman coast, ships that had once carried warriors on raids now brought families from the northern homelands. Women and children crossed the dangerous seas to join husbands and fathers in this new territory, their presence transforming temporary military camps into permanent settlements. The age of raiding was truly ending. The age of building had begun. Through the careful diplomacy that had brought them to this point, both king and duke understood they had embarked on an experiment with no guarantee of success. Yet as the first winter of Norman rule settled over the duchy, signs of promise began to emerge. Trade resumed along rivers that had known only war. Churches rose from the ashes of earlier destruction, and the land itself seemed to breathe more easily under the protection of those who now called it home rather than target. Falaise Castle's peaceful morning was upended by tidings that struck with the suddenness of disaster, foretelling 12 years of disorder. Duke Robert the Magnificent was dead, struck down by fever in far Nicaea while returning from his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The great lord who had united the Norman barons under his iron will would never again see the granite walls of his ancestral seat, never again embrace the bastard son he had acknowledged as his heir. In an instant, the fate of Normandy passed to a boy of 7 summers, and with it came the vultures. In the castle's great hall, where Robert had dispensed justice with the authority of a king, his household gathered to hear the formal announcement that would change everything. The messenger, still dust-covered from his desperate ride across Europe, spoke the words that every noble had dreaded. "The Duke is dead. Long live Duke William." But even as the ritual phrases echoed off ancient stones, men's eyes were already calculating, already measuring the weakness that comes with youth against the opportunities that chaos brings. William himself stood among the mourners, like a small figure carved from pale stone, his face bearing the unreadable expression that would become his trademark in years to come. At 7, he possessed neither the strength to command warriors nor the wisdom to outmaneuver ambitious barons. Yet something in his bearing suggested he understood the magnitude of what had befallen him. The bastard blood that had always marked him as different now became a weapon his enemies would wield without mercy. Across the duchy, the great lords received the news with reactions ranging from genuine grief to barely concealed satisfaction. Duke Robert had been a formidable ruler, one whose personal strength had kept the fractious Norman nobility in line through a combination of charisma and calculated brutality. His death left a vacuum that nature abhors, and into that void rushed men who had chafed under ducal authority for decades, seeing in a child's reign their chance to reclaim powers lost to centralized rule. Like vultures gathering over carrion, the most ambitious barons began their calculations before their late duke was even properly buried. Ralph de Gassé, the boy's own uncle, saw no reason why bastard blood should inherit what legitimate nobility might claim. Guy of Burgundy pressed ancient rights that predated the bastard's birth. Most dangerous of all, the Count of Arquez began fortifying his castles and recruiting mercenaries, his intentions clear to any who possessed eyes to see. No bastard had ever ruled Normandy in his own right, and the precedent troubled even those lords inclined toward loyalty. The duchy had always been a precarious creation, built from the marriage of Norse ruthlessness and Frankish legitimacy. held together by the personal authority of dukes strong enough to make lesser men fear them. Now that authority rested in the hands of a child whose very birth proclaimed his illegitimacy, and the fabric of Norman unity began to fray like cloth left too long in weather. Through the long winter months following Robert's death, the boy duke learned lessons no child should have to master. His guardians, first Osborne the steward, then Gilbert of Brion, fell to assassins' blades, their blood marking the steps of men who found murder easier than open rebellion. Each death brought fresh terror to the ducal household, as those charged with protecting the realm's future found themselves marked for elimination by enemies who preferred shadows to sunlight. From the coastal strongholds where his great-grandfather Rollo had first established Norman power, whispers spread like plague through the countryside. Some said the bastard duke was cursed, that God himself had marked the child for destruction as punishment for his father's sins. Others claimed that true legitimacy could never spring from illegitimate roots, that Normandy deserved a ruler whose birth bore no stain of scandal. All agreed that change was coming, whether through the boy's death or his displacement. When spring came to the Norman countryside in 1047, it brought with it the sound of war. The great barons had moved beyond whispered conspiracy to open rebellion, their banners flying defiantly over castles that had once acknowledged ducal supremacy. At Falaise, the 12-year-old duke found himself besieged, not by foreign enemies, but by his own vassals, men who had sworn oaths of loyalty to his father, now seeking to break the son who reminded them daily of those uncomfortable obligations. Before the assembled rebels could coordinate their final assault on ducal authority, salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. King Henry of France, overlord to whom even Norman dukes owed theoretical allegiance, decided that his interests lay with a weak duke rather than strong rebels. The French monarch had no desire to see a powerful confederation of Norman barons emerge on his border, potentially threatening royal authority in ways that a child ruler never could. The campaign that followed would be remembered as the making of a king, though William bore no crown, save the circlet of ducal authority. Henry's intervention brought professional soldiers and siege engines to supplement the boy's dwindling household guard. But more importantly, it brought legitimacy to a cause that had been faltering under the weight of illegitimate birth and youthful inexperience. With the French king at his side, the bastard duke became something more, a ruler backed by the highest authority in Christian France. Across the fields of Valais-Dunes, two armies faced each other on a January morning that would determine whether Normandy remained united under ducal rule or dissolved into warring fragments. On one side stood the rebel barons with their professional troops and mercenary allies, men who had concluded that might makes right and that a bastard boy had no claim to their obedience. On the other, the boy duke rode beside his royal patron, his young face set with determination that surprised even his supporters. The battle itself unfolded with all the brutality that civil wars demand. Brother fighting, brother across fields that should have known only harvest. Norman cavalry charged Norman infantry, while the boy who would one day conquer England watched his future being decided by the clash of lance and sword. When the rebel line finally broke and their leaders fled the field, more than a military victory had been won. The principle of legitimate succession had been established, and the bastard duke had proven he could command loyalty as well as inherit it. From the blood-soaked earth of Valais-Dunes rose a new Norman order, one forged in the crucible of civil war and tempered by the knowledge that unity required constant vigilance. The boy who had nearly lost everything before his 13th birthday emerged from the conflict with a maturity that war alone can teach, understanding that power must be earned daily, and that mercy, while noble, was often less effective than fear in maintaining the obedience of ambitious men. As winter settled over the Norman countryside once more, the duchy that had seemed destined for dissolution found itself stronger than ever. The failed rebellion had eliminated the most dangerous internal enemies, while demonstrating to remaining barons that challenging ducal authority brought swift and permanent consequences. The bastard duke, no longer merely a child clinging to inherited title, had become a ruler in his own right, one who would remember the lessons of his minority when the time came to claim crowns greater than any his ancestors had worn. From the clash at Hastings emerged not a vulnerable boy, but a leader tested in war, and William saw that such victories meant little without the long grind of rule to secure them. In the months after his triumph over the rebel barons, the young ruler set about rebuilding his territory with the methodical precision that would become his hallmark, replacing the chaos of civil war with an administration more efficient than any his ancestors had known. Across his realm, from the channel ports to the inland forests, the bastard's authority now extended into every village and valley where Norman law held sway. Gone were the days when great lords could ignore his commands or pursue private wars without consequence. In their place emerged a system of governance that balanced traditional Norman customs with innovations borrowed from the most successful kingdoms of Europe, creating something entirely new in the medieval world. William himself had grown into a man whose physical presence commanded attention in any gathering, his tall frame and powerful shoulders marking him as a warrior even when dressed in the robes of statecraft. Yet those who knew him best recognized that his true strength lay not in the sword arm that had proven itself at Hastings, but in the calculating mind that could see 3 moves ahead in the endless game of medieval politics. In the Cathedral of Rouen, where generations of Norman lords had received their authority from God and man alike, the young ruler established a court that drew ambitious young nobles from across northern France. Here, beneath the soaring arches that spoke of divine approval and earthly power, he dispensed justice with a fairness that surprised even his supporters, proving that legitimacy could be earned through wise governance as surely as through victory in battle. Like a master craftsman rebuilding a damaged cathedral, William approached the restoration of his territory with attention to every detail, from the great matters of law and taxation down to the proper maintenance of roads and bridges. His administrators, chosen for competence rather than birth, carried his authority into every corner of the realm, ensuring that his will became local reality through a network of loyal servants who owed their positions to merit rather than inheritance. No longer would Norman barons settle their disputes through private warfare, as had been the custom since his great-grandfather Rollo first established the territory. Instead, his courts provided justice backed by the threat of overwhelming force, while his own household knights stood ready to enforce verdicts that might otherwise be ignored. The rule of law, that precious commodity so rare in medieval Europe, began to take root in Norman soil. Through careful negotiation and strategic alliance, William began weaving his lands into the broader tapestry of European politics. Treaties with neighboring lords secured his borders, while trade agreements brought prosperity to Norman ports that had once known only the chaos of Viking raids. Most importantly, his friendship with King Henry of France, forged in the crucible of civil war, provided security against external enemies who might seek to exploit Norman weakness. From the rebuilding of his territory's internal strength, the young lord's thoughts turned naturally to the question of marriage and succession. A bastard himself, he understood better than most the importance of legitimate heirs, and his advisors had already begun the delicate negotiations that would secure not just a suitable bride, but a political alliance that could reshape the balance of power in northwestern Europe. When messengers arrived from Flanders bearing proposals from Count Baldwin V, they found William ready to consider the most audacious match of the age. Baldwin's daughter Matilda represented everything he needed: royal blood that traced back to Charlemagne himself, connections to the most powerful nobility of the Low Countries, and a dowry that would fill Norman treasuries while cementing crucial alliances. Between William and the Count, negotiations proceeded with the careful precision of men who understood that royal marriages were affairs of state rather than matters of the heart. Yet those who met the Flemish princess reported that she possessed not merely the bloodline that politics demanded, but also the wit and strength of character that would serve a ruler's wife well in the dangerous game of medieval statecraft. The match seemed perfect in all ways, save one: the Church's increasingly strict interpretation of consanguinity laws made their proposed union technically forbidden. Both William and Matilda could trace their lineages back to common ancestors, a relationship that had once troubled no one, but now provided ammunition for enemies who sought to prevent an alliance between Normandy and Flanders. At the papal court in Rome, Pope Leo IX received Norman envoys with the cold courtesy reserved for petitioners whose requests posed political complications. The Holy Father's refusal was couched in language of canonical law and divine will, but those versed in the subtleties of ecclesiastical politics recognized deeper concerns about the growing power that such an alliance would create along the Church's northern borders. Through months of careful diplomacy and strategic pressure, William's representatives worked to overcome papal resistance, while the Duke himself demonstrated the piety and orthodoxy that might persuade reluctant churchmen. New monasteries rose at his command. Existing religious houses received generous endowments, and Norman pilgrims carried tales of their ruler's devotion to distant corners of the Christian world. The breakthrough came not through theological arguments or canonical interpretations, but through the practical politics that governed even the most spiritual institutions. As Leo IX faced challenges to papal authority from multiple quarters, the prospect of Norman support began to outweigh concerns about consanguinity, particularly when coupled with generous donations to Peter's treasury and promises of future cooperation in church affairs. In the spring of 1053, as apple blossoms whitened the Norman countryside, and merchants' ships brought the first goods of the trading season to Rouen busy quays, word arrived that papal dispensation had been granted. The marriage between Duke William and Princess Matilda could proceed, binding together two of Northern Europe's most formidable powers in an alliance that would reshape the medieval world. The wedding itself, celebrated with magnificence befitting such a union, marked more than the joining of two noble houses. It announced Normandy's arrival as a power equal to any kingdom in Christendom. As the bastard took his royal bride's hand before the altar of Rouen Cathedral, those present understood they were witnessing the culmination of a transformation that had begun with a frightened boy clinging to his inheritance, and now reached its climax with a confident ruler ready to claim his place among Europe's greatest princes. The road from Falaise's granite walls, where William learned what it meant to be vulnerable, to the marble chambers where he now received envoys on equal terms, was paved with endurance and shrewd judgment. Yet as he looked out over his consolidated territory from the windows of his palace, the young ruler's thoughts were already turning toward grander ambitions that would soon lead his name across the narrow sea to an island kingdom whose crown glittered with promise just beyond the horizon. It was not war that first sparked the crisis, but a simple reality that loomed over the medieval crown. After 9 years on England's throne, Edward the Confessor still had no heir. In the royal chambers at Westminster, where the childless monarch spent his days in prayer and contemplation, the question of succession hung like storm clouds over a harvest field, growing darker with each passing season that brought no news of a royal pregnancy. Across the Channel, in his newly consolidated duchy, William watched the English situation unfold, with the calculating patience of a hunter observing prey. The Norman ruler understood better than most how quickly political fortunes could shift, how the death of a childless king could transform distant possibilities into immediate opportunities. Through his network of Norman clergy, serving in English churches, and merchants trading in English ports, he maintained constant awareness of every development in Edward's increasingly unstable realm. Edward himself had come to the throne through a combination of Saxon nostalgia and political necessity, his royal blood offering legitimacy to a realm that had known too many foreign rulers. Yet the very qualities that made him acceptable as a compromise candidate, his piety, his lack of strong political connections, his years of exile in Normandy, now threatened to plunge the realm into chaos when death claimed him without leaving a clear successor. In the royal court at Winchester and Westminster, power had gradually concentrated in the hands of men whose fathers had never dreamed of such influence. Chief among these was Godwin, Earl of Wessex, whose wealth and military strength rivaled that of the monarch himself. The Saxon lord had maneuvered his family into positions of extraordinary power, controlling vast estates across southern England, while his sons held earldoms that gave them authority over much of the realm's military resources. Like a spider sitting at the center of an intricate web, Earl Godwin had spent decades weaving connections that stretched from the royal court to the humblest village church. His daughter Edith had married the king himself, making the Earl father-in-law to the crown of England. His eldest son, Harold, controlled the strategically vital earldom of East Anglia, while other sons held territories that collectively commanded more knights and ferdmen than any other family in the realm. No marriage had ever been more politically calculated or personally disappointing than the union between the pious Edward and Godwin's ambitious daughter. The ruler's devotion to celibacy, whether from religious conviction or personal inclination, had effectively nullified what should have been the most important political alliance in the realm. The childless royal marriage left Godwin's family in the curious position of being intimately connected to the crown while having no claim to inherit it. Through the long months of 1051, tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of English politics finally boiled over into open confrontation. The immediate cause was seemingly trivial, a dispute over the appointment of archbishops and the influence of Norman clerics, whom the king favoured over Saxon candidates. Yet those who understood the deeper currents of power recognized that this was fundamentally a struggle between two visions of England's future, one that looked backward to Saxon traditions, another that embraced continental connections. From his stronghold in Kent, Earl Godwin marshalled his forces with the efficiency that had made him the most feared warrior in England. His sons brought their own retinues to join the family's household troops, creating an army that approached royal proportions. For a brief moment in that autumn of crisis, it seemed that civil war must inevitably follow, brother fighting brother in the same fields where their fathers had united to resist Viking invasion. When the final confrontation came, it unfolded not through battle, but through a test of wills that revealed the true balance of power in Edward's realm. At Gloucester, where both royal and Godwin armies had gathered, the crown's supporters proved more numerous than the Earl had anticipated. Faced with the choice between certain defeat and strategic retreat, the old warrior chose exile, leading his family across the Channel to seek refuge in Flanders, while their enemies celebrated premature victory. Between Norman ambition and Saxon tradition lay the sudden opportunity that William had been watching for since his marriage to Matilda had secured his position at home. With the Godwin family in exile and Edward temporarily freed from their domination, the childless monarch found himself with unprecedented freedom to shape his realm's future, and perhaps to honor old friendships forged during his own years of exile in Norman courts. The visit that followed would be disputed by chroniclers for centuries to come, its very occurrence questioned by some historians, while others insisted on its fundamental importance to later events. Yet Norman sources consistently maintained that in the winter of 1051, with England temporarily free from Godwin influence, Edward welcomed his old friend William to Westminster, with honours befitting a future heir to the English crown. Across the frost-covered fields of southern England, the Norman ruler travelled with a small but impressive retinue, his presence causing excitement in royal courts that had grown accustomed to political isolation. Here was a man who commanded respect throughout northern France, whose marriage connections reached to the greatest noble houses of the continent, whose military reputation had been proven in the crucible of civil war and territorial expansion. In the great hall at Westminster, where Saxon rulers had held court since time immemorial, two leaders met to discuss the future of a realm whose fate hung in the balance between competing dynasties and conflicting loyalties. The conversations that took place between Edward and his Norman guest were private, witnessed only by a handful of trusted advisors whose later testimony would be coloured by political necessity and personal interest. The promise that Norman chroniclers claimed was made during those winter meetings, Edward's pledge that William should succeed him as ruler of England, would become the central justification for events that lay still years in the future. Whether the childless monarch actually offered his crown to his Norman friend, or whether ambitious men later constructed such claims from more ambiguous conversations, the alleged commitment would provide the legal foundation for conquest and transformation. As spring returned to the English countryside, and William prepared for his journey back to Normandy, both men understood that they had set in motion forces that could not easily be controlled. The Godwin family remained in exile, but their supporters throughout the kingdom waited for opportunities to restore their lords to power. The succession question remained unanswered, but new claimants had entered the game with promises that might prove either golden opportunities or worthless paper, depending on how fortune's wheel turned. From the deck of his ship, as it carried him back across the channel, William could see the English coast receding into morning mist, but his mind was already working on the complex calculations that might one day bring him back as something more than a royal guest. The bastard who had secured his own duchy through blood and determination now had reason to believe that a greater prize might await his grasp, if only he possessed the patience to wait and the strength to seize the moment when it came. Exile had sharpened, rather than weakened, the Godwin family's appetite for power, and their return to England came not as supplicants begging royal mercy, but as conquerors reclaiming what they considered rightfully theirs. Through the summer of 1052, while Edward's Norman advisors watched nervously from Westminster's walls, the old Earl's supporters throughout southern England began stirring with anticipation of their lord's restoration. From Flanders, where Count Baldwin had provided sanctuary during their year of banishment, Godwin's ships appeared in the Thames estuary like ghosts returning from the dead. The fleet that accompanied the family's homecoming carried not just the exiled lords, but also Flemish mercenaries and English refugees who had fled the kingdom during the political purges that followed the Gloucester crisis. This was no humble return, but a military expedition designed to reclaim by force what diplomacy had lost. Harold himself had grown from promising young nobleman into seasoned war leader during his months abroad, his natural talents honed by necessity, and his ambitions expanded by the bitter lessons of political defeat. At 28, Godwin's eldest son possessed the military skill to command armies and the political acumen to navigate the treacherous currents of court intrigue. Most importantly, he had learned that in medieval politics, strength mattered more than legitimacy when the two came into conflict. Across the Thames from London, father and son established their base with the confidence of men who knew the political wind had shifted in their favour. Edward's experiment with Norman governance had proven deeply unpopular among the Saxon nobility, while the monarch's increasing devotion to religious matters had left practical administration in the hands of foreign advisers who understood neither English law nor English custom. Like a hunting pack that had scented wounded prey, supporters flocked to the Godwin standard from every shire where the family had once held influence. Earl Leofric of Mercia, no friend to the House of Wessex in normal times, nevertheless recognized that the restoration of native English leadership served his own interests better than continued Norman dominance. Even Archbishop Stigand threw his ecclesiastical weight behind the returning exiles. Victory came not through pitched battle, but through the irresistible force of political inevitability. When Edward's remaining Norman supporters realized they faced an entire kingdom in rebellion, most chose discretion over valor, fleeing across the Channel to carry tales of Saxon ingratitude back to their homeland. The monarch himself, isolated and abandoned, had no choice but to welcome his former enemies back into royal favor and pretend their year of exile had been a minor misunderstanding. Storm clouds that had gathered over the English succession during the Godwins' absence now darkened further as Harold consolidated his position as the most powerful earl in the kingdom. With his father's death in 1053, the young lord inherited not just the vast earldom of Wessex, but also the network of allies and obligations that made him the real power behind Edward's throne. From Portsmouth to the Scottish border, no major decision could be made without consulting the man who commanded more troops than the crown itself. When Harold's ambitions turned westward toward the Celtic principalities that had long troubled England's borders, he found in Wales both opportunity and challenge perfectly suited to his talents. Prince Gruffydd ap Llywelyn had united the fractious Welsh tribes under his banner, creating the first genuinely unified Welsh state in centuries, and posing a threat to English border security that demanded decisive response. Count Guy of Ponthieu would later curse the storm that drove Harold's ship onto his shores in 1064, for that seemingly minor accident would provide the Norman court with its most powerful weapon in the propaganda war that preceded conquest. The Earl's mission, whether diplomatic, military, or personal, remains disputed by historians, but the consequences of his forced stay in continental Europe would reshape the destiny of two kingdoms. Under ducal hospitality that concealed calculated political maneuvering, the Earl found himself guest and prisoner simultaneously in William's court. The Duke, who had once visited England as Edward's friend, now played host to the man who stood between him and his alleged inheritance, and their conversations during those crucial weeks would be remembered very differently by continental and English chroniclers. From hunting expeditions in the duchy's forests to formal ceremonies in Rouen cathedral, William orchestrated his guest's visit with the skill of a master diplomat, extracting maximum advantage from an unexpected opportunity. The English lord, for his part, navigated the dangerous currents of ducal hospitality while seeking to accomplish his original mission and return safely to England with his authority intact. Between host and guest lay unspoken understanding of the stakes involved in their seemingly cordial relationship. William needed legitimacy for his English claims that went beyond Edward's alleged promise, while the Earl required safe passage home to a kingdom where his continued absence might encourage rivals to advance their own ambitions. Each man possessed something the other desperately wanted, creating the conditions for either genuine agreement or elaborate deception. Victory in Wales had established Godwin's son as England's premier military commander, but his experience in Normandy would test diplomatic skills that proved equally formidable. Whether he genuinely swore the oath that continental sources claimed, promising to support William's succession to the English throne, or whether such oaths were extracted through coercion or invented entirely by chroniclers with political agendas, the alleged commitment would become central to later justifications for conquest. Around the sacred relics that filled Rouen Cathedral, witnessed by the greatest lords of the ducal court, some ceremony certainly took place that bound the two men in oaths whose exact nature would be disputed for centuries. Continental sources described elaborate rituals of homage and fealty, while English accounts remained conspicuously silent about any commitments that might compromise their lord's future freedom of action. Through the careful choreography of medieval diplomacy, the English Earl eventually secured his release and returned to England, but not without leaving behind hostages whose safety would depend on his future behavior. His nephew and younger brother remained in ducal custody as guarantees of the agreements made, whether those agreements were freely given or extracted under duress that made them invalid under both civil and canon law. As the Earl's ship carried him back across the Channel toward the English coast, both he and his ducal host understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. No longer were they simply Earl and foreign duke conducting routine diplomatic business. They had become rivals for a crown whose current wearer grew frailer with each passing season, and whose death would trigger the greatest succession crisis in English history. Standing on Dover's pale cliffs, with the short stretch of sea between two kingdoms growing ever more bound together, Godwin's son looked toward the land where his influence was greatest and his burdens heaviest. Yet behind him in Normandy, another claimant to English greatness was already beginning the preparations that would one day bring fire and sword to the very shores the Earl now approached with such relief. Political tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of English governance for years finally erupted into open crisis during the winter of 1065, when the northern province of Northumbria rose in rebellion against its appointed Earl. What began as local grievances against harsh taxation and foreign influence quickly escalated into a constitutional crisis that would test the kingdom's stability in the crucial months before Edward's death. In Northumbria's wind-swept halls, where Viking jarls had once dispensed rough justice and Saxon thanes now struggled to maintain order, resentment against Tostig Godwinson had been building like water behind a cracking dam. The Earl's attempts to impose southern administrative practices on northern traditions had created friction, while his heavy taxation to fund military campaigns struck his subjects as little better than Viking tribute dressed in Christian clothing. Edward's health had been declining visibly throughout 1064, his once sturdy frame growing gaunt as the burdens of kingship weighed ever more heavily upon shoulders that seemed increasingly fragile. Court observers noted how the monarch's hands trembled during religious ceremonies, how his voice had grown thin and reedy when pronouncing judgments that would once have rung with royal authority. The succession question, long deferred, could no longer be avoided. Tostig himself had grown increasingly isolated from his own people, his natural arrogance inflamed by years of wielding power without effective opposition. Unlike his brother, who had learned to balance strength with diplomacy, the Northern Earl ruled through fear and punishment, believing that harsh measures would eventually break the spirit of resistance among his turbulent subjects. When rebellion finally erupted in the autumn of 1065, it came with a swiftness that caught even experienced political observers by surprise. The rebels seized York, the ancient capital of the north, and proclaimed their rejection of Tostig's authority with a decisiveness that spoke of careful planning and widespread popular support. What made this rising truly dangerous was its organized nature. This was not a spontaneous outburst of peasant anger, but a coordinated revolt by the northern nobility. Against this backdrop of domestic crisis, the aging monarch found himself caught between conflicting loyalties and impossible choices. Supporting Tostig meant potentially triggering civil war at the worst possible moment, when his own death might leave the kingdom vulnerable to external enemies. Yet abandoning his brother-in-law would set a dangerous precedent and weaken royal authority throughout the realm. Winter brought the crisis to Westminster's marble halls, where Edward's court wrestled with decisions that would shape England's future. The northern rebels had not merely expelled their earl, they had chosen his replacement, elevating young Morcar, brother of Earl Edwin of Mercia, to the position and demanding royal confirmation of their choice. This direct challenge to royal prerogative represented a fundamental threat to monarchical authority. Through Westminster's corridors, where power brokers had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythms of Edward's reign, uncertainty now stalked like a plague. The monarch's obvious physical decline had emboldened ambitious nobles who sensed opportunity in the coming transition, while foreign observers watched English politics with the calculating attention of vultures awaiting carrion. Noble families across the kingdom began positioning themselves for the succession struggle that everyone knew was approaching. Some threw their support behind the northern rebels, seeing in Morcar's elevation an opportunity to check the Godwins' overwhelming power. Others remained loyal to the established order, fearing that successful rebellion in Northumbria might encourage similar uprisings elsewhere. By Christmas of 1065, Edward had made the decision that would define his final months as ruler of England. Rather than risk civil war by supporting his brother-in-law, the monarch chose to ratify the rebels' choice and confirm Morcar as Earl of Northumbria. The decision represented a stunning defeat for Tostig and a significant weakening of the Godwin family's previously unassailable position. Throughout these months of crisis, one figure stood at the center of every crucial negotiation, every vital decision that would determine whether England descended into chaos or maintained the stability that had made it one of Europe's richest kingdoms. Earl of Wessex, commander of the realm's largest military force, and heir to the most powerful noble house in the land, he had become the man upon whom Edward's failing authority increasingly depended. His role in resolving the northern crisis had demonstrated both his political wisdom and his understanding that England's future required careful balance between competing factions. By supporting the compromise that elevated Morcar while maintaining overall stability, he had proven himself capable of placing the kingdom's welfare above narrow family interests, a quality that would prove crucial in the trials ahead. As winter deepened and Edward's strength continued to ebb, the succession question could no longer be postponed through diplomatic evasion or royal reluctance to name an heir. The monarch's childless marriage, once a minor inconvenience, had become a constitutional crisis waiting to unfold. Every major noble family in the kingdom understood that the old order was passing, and with it would come opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Within Westminster's ancient walls, where Saxon kings had ruled for generations, preparations began for what everyone suspected would be Edward's final Christmas court. The ceremonies proceeded with traditional magnificence. But beneath the surface of royal protocol, ambitious men were already calculating the odds in the great game that would begin the moment the Confessor drew his last breath. Palace physicians who had tended the royal household for decades recognized the signs that courtiers preferred to ignore. The labored breathing, the periods of confusion, the way Edward's attention seemed increasingly focused on spiritual rather than temporal matters. The kingdom's most pious ruler was preparing for his final pilgrimage, one from which no earthly authority could call him back. When the new year dawned over England in 1066, it brought with it the certainty that momentous change lay just ahead. The northern crisis had been resolved, but at the cost of weakening royal authority and emboldening regional independence. The succession remained unsettled, despite years of speculation and maneuvering. Most ominously, across the Channel in Normandy, another claimant to English greatness was watching these developments with the patient attention of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Death came for Edward the Confessor in the grey hours before dawn on January 5th, 1066, ending 24 years of rule that had brought England prosperity and peace, but left the kingdom without a clear successor. In the royal chambers at Westminster Palace, where the childless monarch had spent his final months in prayer and contemplation, the political crisis that had loomed for years finally crystallized into immediate, desperate urgency. Around the royal deathbed gathered the most powerful nobles in the realm, men whose decisions in the next few hours would determine whether England faced civil war or smooth transition. Archbishop Stigand stood ready to perform the last rites, while Earl Harold maintained his vigil beside the man who had become far more than overlord. Friend, mentor, and the only father figure the Godwin heir had truly known since his own sire's death 13 years earlier. Within hours of Edward's passing, messengers raced along muddy winter roads to carry news that would reshape the political landscape of northwestern Europe. The question that had haunted English politics for over a decade, who would succeed the childless Confessor, now demanded immediate answer, and the men gathered at Westminster understood that delay meant disaster. Westminster Abbey, where Edward's greatest architectural achievement soared toward heaven in stone testimony to royal piety, became the stage for ceremonies that would echo through history. The magnificent church, barely completed and still smelling of fresh mortar, would witness its first royal funeral and coronation within 24 hours, as England's nobility moved with unprecedented speed to fill the dangerous vacuum left by their monarch's death. Across the Channel, in his ducal capital, another claimant to English greatness would soon learn that his moment of destiny had arrived earlier than expected. The Norman court had been following Edward's decline with intense interest, and advanced preparations for pressing William's claim had been underway for months. Yet the speed of events in England would catch even the most experienced continental politicians off guard. Papal legates who had spent years cultivating relationships with both English and continental courts suddenly found their carefully balanced diplomacy tested by the urgent need to choose sides. The question was no longer whether Edward's alleged promise to the Norman Duke carried legal weight, but whether the Church would support accomplished fact or disputed claim in the crucial struggle that everyone knew must follow. Throughout England, from the Scottish borders to the Channel coast, royal officials began the delicate process of transferring loyalty to a new sovereign whose legitimacy rested on rapid acceptance rather than unquestioned right. The Witan's hasty assembly and immediate approval of the succession would provide constitutional cover for what was essentially a political coup executed with breathtaking audacity. News of the coronation that followed Edward's funeral by less than 24 hours would send shockwaves through every court in Europe, where ambitious princes had been calculating their chances of claiming the English crown. The speed with which Earl Harold had moved from powerful nobleman to anointed sovereign left rivals with no time to organize opposition or press competing claims through established diplomatic channels. In Rouen's ducal palace, where tapestries depicted the conquest of distant lands and the founding of Norman greatness, William received reports of English developments with the controlled fury of a man who saw his greatest opportunity slipping away through another's bold action. The Duke, who had waited patiently for Edward's death, now found himself facing not a disputed succession, but an accomplished coronation. Meanwhile, in the great halls of Scandinavian courts, other claimants to English heritage began stirring with interest that would soon harden into military preparation. Harold Hardrada of Norway, whose royal blood and Viking legacy gave him claims that predated both Norman and Saxon pretensions, watched English affairs with the calculating attention of a warrior who had spent decades waiting for precisely such an opportunity. The ceremony in Westminster Abbey that transformed Earl Harold into King Harold II proceeded with all the ancient solemnity that English tradition required. Yet everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in its political implications. No English nobleman had ever moved so swiftly from subject to sovereign, and the constitutional innovations required to justify such speed would be debated by chroniclers and lawyers for generations. Archbishop Stigand, despite questions about his own canonical status that would later provide enemies with ammunition, placed the crown of England upon the new ruler's head with hands that had served 3 previous monarchs. The sacred oils that anointed Harold as God's chosen representative on earth carried the same divine authority that had blessed Saxon rulers since the conversion of their pagan ancestors centuries before. Beneath the soaring arches of Edward's architectural masterpiece, witnessed by the greatest nobles of the realm, the bastard son of Earl Godwin became Harold Rex Anglorum. Harold, by grace of God, ruler of the English. The transformation was complete, but its acceptance by rival claimants remained very much in doubt, and the new sovereign's first acts would be guided by the certain knowledge that his crown would soon be tested in ways that no previous English ruler had faced. Outside Westminster's walls, where London's merchants and craftsmen went about their daily business, few yet understood that their kingdom had entered the most dangerous period in its history since the Viking invasions of centuries past. The swift succession that had prevented immediate civil war had also guaranteed external challenges that would test English independence in ways Edward's peaceful reign had never required. Church bells that rang out across London to announce the new ruler's coronation also carried their bronze voices across the narrow sea to Norman shores, where another claimant was already beginning the diplomatic and military preparations that would transform 1066 from a year of succession into an epoch of conquest. The die was cast, the players positioned, and the greatest invasion since Caesar's legions crossed the Channel was about to begin. As January snow fell softly on Westminster's ancient stones, covering the graves of Saxon kings and the foundations of Norman ambitions alike, England's newly crowned sovereign faced the greatest challenge any medieval ruler could confront: defending a throne claimed by right of speed against enemies who would argue right of promise, blood, and conquest. The year that would decide the fate of nations had begun with a funeral, a coronation, and the certain knowledge that war must follow. Spring brought with it reports that chilled the blood of even the most experienced English commanders, as intelligence from across the known world confirmed what the newly crowned sovereign had feared most. His rapid coronation had not prevented rival claims, but merely ensured that multiple enemies would coordinate their challenges to his authority with unprecedented determination. Along England's southern coast, from Dover's white cliffs to Portsmouth's natural harbour, royal engineers worked frantically to strengthen defences that had grown complacent during Edward's peaceful reign. Watchtowers that had stood empty for decades suddenly bristled with signal fires, ready to carry warning of invasion, while coastal fortresses received their first serious attention since the Danish wars of the previous century. Harold's spies, that network of merchants, pilgrims, and clerics who had served the Godwin family faithfully for generations, now carried back reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of the forces gathering against England's independence. What emerged was not the threat of a single ambitious neighbour, but a coordinated assault by enemies who had transformed personal grievances into international crusade. In Norman harbours, from Barfleur to Dives-sur-Mer, shipwrights laboured day and night to construct the largest invasion fleet northern Europe had seen since the Vikings first terrorized Christian shores. Under William's direct supervision, forests fell to provide timber for vessels designed not for raiding, but for conquest. Ships capable of carrying not just warriors, but horses, siege engines, and all the apparatus needed to establish permanent occupation rather than temporary plunder. Across the northern seas, in the fjords and harbours of Norway, where dragon ships had slumbered through decades of relative peace, another fleet was taking shape under the direction of a ruler whose very name struck fear into the hearts of enemies from Byzantium to the Atlantic. Harold Hardrada, the Thunderbolt of the North, commanded resources that dwarfed those of any previous Viking expedition, and his alliance with England's disgraced exile promised local knowledge to complement Scandinavian might. Diplomatic envoys travelling the courts of Europe carried with them papal letters that transformed what might have been seen as naked aggression into holy war, blessed by the highest authority in Christendom. The banner of St. Peter, granted to the Norman cause by Pope Alexander II, provided divine sanction for invasion, while promising spiritual rewards for those who joined the enterprise against the allegedly perjured usurper who sat upon England's throne. Storm winds that howled across the Channel through the late spring and early summer of 1066 provided England's only respite from the mounting pressure, as adverse weather conditions prevented the coordinated assault that might otherwise have overwhelmed even the most determined resistance. Yet these same storms that delayed enemy action also strained English resources, forcing the new ruler to maintain expensive defensive preparations for months longer than anyone had anticipated. By midsummer, the scale of the threats facing English independence had become clear to even the most optimistic observers. This was no longer a question of repelling a single ambitious neighbour or dealing with routine border disputes, but a fight for national survival against enemies whose coordination and resources suggested careful planning that had been years in the making. Intelligence reports filtering back from continental courts painted an alarming picture of the breadth of support that the Norman cause had attracted. Breton nobles eager for English lands, Flemish merchants anticipating new trading opportunities, even German adventurers seeking their fortunes in conquest, all had rallied to banners that promised rich rewards for successful invasion of the wealthy kingdom across the narrow sea. Channel waters that had protected England from foreign invasion for generations now seemed barely adequate barriers against the forces gathering on distant shores. The wooden walls of English naval power, never strong enough to challenge the great continental powers, appeared pathetically inadequate when measured against fleets whose very construction represented the combined resources of multiple kingdoms united in common cause. What made the situation truly desperate was the timing that fate and enemy calculation had imposed upon English defences. The agricultural calendar that governed medieval warfare meant that the kingdom's military forces could not remain mobilized indefinitely without causing economic collapse. Yet demobilization would invite immediate assault by enemies who had spent months preparing for precisely such an opportunity. Throughout the summer months, as harvest time approached, and the Fyrd grew restless for return to their farms and workshops. The newly crowned ruler faced the impossible choice between maintaining ruinously expensive defenses and risking the destruction of his kingdom through military unpreparedness. The strategic initiative had passed to his enemies, who could choose their moment of attack while England could only wait and watch. Border fortresses along the Scottish frontier reported increased activity that suggested coordination between northern enemies and continental invaders, raising the spectre of simultaneous attacks that would stretch English resources beyond their breaking point. The isolation that had once protected the island kingdom now threatened to become fatal weakness in the face of enemies who had learned to cooperate across traditional boundaries. Royal councils that met through those anxious summer months wrestled with calculations that offered no comfortable solutions. Every strategic decision carried enormous risks, and the margin for error had shrunk to virtually nothing as enemy preparations reached completion and the campaigning season approached its climax. As August faded into September and the first hints of autumn touched the English countryside, the long period of waiting seemed finally approaching its end. Enemy fleets that had spent months in preparation were nearly ready for sea, and the favourable winds that invasion required would soon begin blowing from the continental shores, where England's destiny was being decided by forces beyond any single ruler's control. Standing watch from coastal towers that had become England's first line of defence, sentries strained their eyes toward horizons that might at any moment reveal the sails that would bring war to shores that had known peace for a generation. The year that had begun with a funeral and coronation was approaching its climax in a test of strength that would determine whether English independence could survive the greatest coordinated assault any medieval kingdom had ever faced. September's chill winds carried more than the promise of autumn when they filled the sails of 300 longships ascending the Yorkshire coast, their dragon prows cutting through grey waters toward an invasion that would test English resolve in ways the southern threat had not yet demanded. The northern assault that military strategists had long anticipated was finally unfolding with the precision and overwhelming force that only Harold Hardrada could command. Up the Humber River, past marshlands where Roman legions had once marched and Viking raiders had established their first English kingdoms, the greatest fleet of the age carried warriors whose very presence announced that the old world of isolated island kingdoms was ending forever. The thunderbolt of the north had brought not merely an army, but a migration of ambitious men seeking new lands and greater opportunities than Scandinavian shores could provide. At Fulford Gate, where ancient roads converged outside York's walls, the first major battle of 1066 unfolded, with results that sent shockwaves through Harold's defences and encouraged every enemy of the new reign. Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, commanding the flower of northern nobility, met the Norwegian advance with confidence born of generations of successful resistance to foreign invasion. News of the disaster that followed reached the southern court with the speed that only catastrophic defeat can inspire, carried by survivors whose very survival testified to the completeness of their army's destruction. The cream of northern military power lay scattered across Yorkshire fields, their leaders captured or slain, their regional resistance broken by warriors who fought with the disciplined ferocity that had made Norse arms feared from Constantinople to Greenland. 200 miles south, where the newly crowned ruler had been monitoring Norman preparations while maintaining his coastal defences, the intelligence from Yorkshire forced an immediate and agonizing strategic decision. The northern invasion could not be ignored. York's fall would provide Harold Hardrada with a base from which to conquer all of England north of the Humber, effectively partitioning the kingdom and destroying any hope of coordinated resistance to other threats. Harold's forced march northward represented one of the most remarkable military achievements in medieval warfare, as his household troops and hastily summoned fyrdmen covered distances that should have taken weeks in mere days of relentless movement. The speed with which royal forces redeployed from Channel defences to Yorkshire battlefields demonstrated both the logistical capabilities that the Godwin family had developed over decades of military campaigning and the desperate urgency that drove their efforts. Dawn broke over Stamford Bridge on September 25th, with a clarity that seemed to promise decisive resolution to the northern threat. As Harold's army approached the crossing, where Norwegian forces had gathered to receive tribute from their conquered territories, the scene that greeted royal scouts was one of dangerous overconfidence. Enemy warriors scattered across both sides of the river, their weapons and armor laid aside in the warmth of unexpected sunshine. When the attack began, it struck with the fury of men fighting for their homeland against invaders who had grown careless in victory's aftermath. The initial assault caught the Norwegians completely unprepared, their forces divided by the river and unable to coordinate resistance against enemies who fell upon them like wolves upon scattered sheep. By midday, the battle had become a slaughter that would be remembered as long as men sang songs of Harold's victories over foreign invaders. Harold Hardrada, the last of the great Viking warriors, fell with an arrow through his throat, his death marking the end of an era that had begun with the first dragon ships to terrorize Christian shores. Beside him died Tostig Godwinson, the exile whose alliance with Norway's ruler had brought this catastrophe upon his own people. Victory's price revealed itself in the afternoon's grim accounting, as royal commanders surveyed a battlefield littered with the bodies of men who had sailed from distant fjords with dreams of conquest and settlement. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegian host to these shores, barely 24 were needed to carry home the survivors, a testament to the thoroughness of Harold's triumph and the finality of the northern threat's elimination. Yet even in triumph, shadows of future danger darkened the celebration that should have followed such a complete victory over foreign invasion. Messengers arriving from the south carried news that transformed military success into strategic disaster. While Harold's forces had been engaged in Yorkshire, Norman fleets had finally crossed the Channel and established themselves on the kingdom's soil. The tactical brilliance that had destroyed the Norwegian invasion in a single afternoon now seemed meaningless against the larger strategic picture that was unfolding with remorseless logic. The very speed and decisiveness of victory at Stamford Bridge had exhausted the realm's reserves at precisely the moment when they would be needed most urgently in the south, where another invasion demanded immediate response. Standing amid the carnage that marked the end of the Viking Age in Britain, Harold faced the bitter knowledge that his greatest military triumph might prove to be the prelude to his kingdom's destruction. The northern threat had been eliminated, but at costs that could not be sustained when other enemies had chosen their moment of attack with such calculated precision. Orders went out immediately for the rapid redeployment southward that would test the kingdom's military capabilities beyond anything previously attempted, as forces that had just completed one of the war's most demanding campaigns prepared for an even more challenging ordeal. The luxury of rest and reorganization that victory should have provided was denied by enemies whose coordination had turned strategic advantages into fatal weaknesses. Burial parties that should have been celebrating the salvation of northern Britain instead worked with the desperate efficiency of men who knew that greater trials lay just ahead, their grim task complicated by the knowledge that many of the same warriors who had fallen Norwegian champions might soon be called upon to face Norman knights in battles that would determine the kingdom's ultimate fate. As September waned and the first reports of southern landings confirmed everyone's worst fears. The remnants of Harold's northern army began their race against time toward a confrontation that would decide whether the realm's independence could survive the greatest test any medieval kingdom had ever faced. The victory that should have secured the nation had instead set the stage for its greatest trial, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing in the face of enemies whose timing and coordination had transformed triumph into potential catastrophe. Favorable winds that had eluded the invasion preparations for months finally filled the sails of the fleet on September 27th, carrying 700 vessels loaded with the dreams and ambitions of half the nobility of northern France towards shores that had remained unconquered since the Romans withdrew their legions 6 centuries earlier. The greatest gamble in medieval warfare was about to unfold on the beaches of Sussex. Under cover of pre-dawn darkness, the first Continental scouts waded ashore at Pevensey Bay to find the beaches empty of defenders, their signal fires unlit, the coastal fortifications that should have bristled with spears and arrows, standing silent as abandoned tombs. The very completeness of Harold's victory in the north had created the opportunity that William's intelligence network had been designed to exploit. William himself was among the first to set foot on the shingle beach, his boots crunching on stones that would either witness the foundation of a new dynasty or become the graveyard of Norman ambitions. Legend would later claim that the Duke stumbled as he landed, only to grasp handfuls of sand and declare he was seizing his rightful inheritance. But such stories emerged only after victory had transformed every omen into prophecy fulfilled. At Pevensey's ancient Roman walls, where Saxon shore forts had once guarded against the very kind of seaborne invasion now unfolding with methodical precision, the Duke's engineers began the systematic fortification that would provide secure bases for the campaign ahead. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder, but conquerors planning permanent occupation, and their earthworks rose with the efficiency of men who understood the mathematics of siege warfare. Construction began immediately on the prefabricated wooden fortifications that the invasion ships had carried in sections across the channel, their assembly proceeding with the speed that only careful preparation could achieve. Within hours of landing, what had been empty coastline became a fortified beachhead, capable of withstanding assault by any force the kingdom could deploy on short notice. Across the rolling downs of Sussex, Continental cavalry began the systematic devastation that would force Harold into the rapid response that his enemies were counting upon. This was not random destruction, but calculated provocation, designed to make the southern invasion impossible to ignore, while the northern victory was still being consolidated. Local populations, who had known nothing but peace during Edward's reign, suddenly found themselves facing the realities of medieval warfare as practiced by Continental professionals. Villages that had stood for generations vanished in smoke, their inhabitants driven into the forests with nothing but the clothes they wore, their livestock herded into Norman camps to feed an army that had crossed the sea with conquest rather than mere raid in mind. Meanwhile, in the ancient stronghold of Hastings, William's advance forces established the second major base that would anchor their position, while the main army completed its landing operations. The town's strategic location, commanding the approaches from London while remaining within easy reach of the beachhead, made it the obvious choice for the Duke's forward headquarters. Intelligence of the landing reached Harold while he was still celebrating victory over the Norwegian threat, transforming triumph into catastrophe with the speed that only the most efficient messenger networks could achieve. The news that arrived with exhausted riders who had pushed their horses to the breaking point painted a picture of systematic invasion rather than opportunistic raid. By October 1st, the scope of the Continental enterprise had become clear to even the most optimistic observers in Harold's court. This was not merely another cross-channel adventure by ambitious neighbors, but a full-scale conquest attempt backed by resources that dwarfed anything the kingdom had faced since the Danish invasions of previous centuries. Reports from Sussex described an invasion force whose organization and equipment suggested years of planning and preparation. Continental cavalry, virtually unknown in Britain, provided mobile striking power that traditional defensive strategies had never been designed to counter. Siege engines capable of reducing stone fortifications accompanied an army that clearly intended to fight its way to London if necessary. What made the situation truly desperate was the timing that enemy coordination had imposed upon the kingdom's defenders. Harold's northern army, exhausted by forced marches and brutal combat, now faced the prospect of an equally demanding southern campaign, without the rest and reinforcement that military necessity demanded. The provocation strategy that William's raiders employed throughout Sussex was producing exactly the results that the Duke's planners had anticipated. Each burning village, each slaughtered herd, each family driven from ancestral lands created pressure for immediate response that made careful military preparation impossible. Across the ancient Roman roads that connected London to the Channel ports, royal messengers carried summons for the general levy that represented Harold's last hope of assembling forces adequate to meet the invasion. The Fyrd that had served the kingdom faithfully for generations now faced its greatest test, called to arms at harvest time to defend a realm whose survival hung in the balance. Strategic calculations that should have favored defenders fighting on familiar ground against enemies operating far from their bases were complicated by the speed with which events were unfolding, and the exhaustion that the northern campaign had imposed on the kingdom's best troops. Every advantage that geography and preparation should have provided was being neutralized by circumstances beyond any single commander's control. Continental earthworks that rose daily around Pevensey and Hastings created an expanding zone of enemy control that threatened to become permanent if not challenged quickly. Yet the very speed with which such challenges would have to be mounted guaranteed that they would lack the careful preparation that military success required. From his headquarters in the captured town, William could observe the smoke columns that marked his army's progress through the Sussex countryside, while calculating the political pressures that such destruction would place upon his rival. The systematic ravaging of Harold's own family estates carried personal as well as strategic significance, transforming what might have been treated as routine border warfare into matters of family honor that demanded immediate response. As September gave way to October and the invasion entered its second week, both commanders understood that the preliminary maneuvering was approaching its end. Harold could not allow the systematic destruction of southern Britain to continue indefinitely. While William could not maintain his position on hostile shores without decisive action that would either secure his conquest or result in catastrophic defeat, the stage was set for the confrontation that both rulers had been calculating since the moment of Edward's death, though neither could have foreseen the exact circumstances that would bring their armies together on the ridges and valleys of Sussex, where the fate of medieval Europe would be decided by the clash of Saxon axe and Norman lance. October 14th dawned grey and cold over the Sussex Downs, the autumn mist clinging to valleys that would soon echo with the clash of arms and the cries of dying men. Two armies faced each other across fields that had known only the peaceful rhythms of harvest and sowing, their banners snapping in the wind like the wings of carrion birds already gathering for the feast to come. Across Senlac Ridge, where Harold had chosen to make his stand, the flower of what remained of the kingdom's military strength arranged itself in the ancient formation that had served Saxon warriors since their ancestors first crossed the northern seas. The shield wall stretched across the hilltop like a glittering serpent of bronze and steel. Each overlapping shield a scale in the armor that protected the realm's final hope. Harold's army represented everything that remained of resistance to foreign conquest. Household troops whose loyalty had been tested in a dozen campaigns. Thanes whose fathers had stood with previous rulers against Danish invasions. Ferdmen summoned from harvest fields to defend homes they might never see again. Exhausted by the forced march from Yorkshire, depleted by the northern campaign, they nonetheless stood ready to die rather than yield their independence. Dawn revealed the continental force that had crossed the narrow sea to claim a crown by right of conquest, their ordered ranks extending across the valley floor in formations that spoke of professional discipline and careful planning. Knights whose mail gleamed like silver in the morning light sat their destriers with the confidence of men who had made warfare their life's profession, while infantry and archers filled the gaps between cavalry units with mathematical precision. For hours, the two armies observed each other across the space where destiny would be decided, each commander seeking advantage in the deployment and disposition of forces whose clash would determine whether the island kingdom remained independent or passed under foreign rule. The mathematics of medieval warfare had reduced the complexity of politics and diplomacy to its simplest terms: strength against strength, will against will, life against death. Continental archers opened the battle with volleys that darkened the sky like clouds of locusts, their arrows falling among defenders who raised shields against the iron rain, while holding formation with the discipline that generations of training had instilled. The sound of bronze points striking wood and leather created a drumbeat that would continue throughout the longest day in the kingdom's history. When the first cavalry charge thundered up the slope toward the shield wall, it came with all the irresistible force that had made continental knights the masters of European battlefields. Destriers bred for war carried armored riders whose lances gleamed like deadly flowers in the morning light, their war cries echoing off the hills as they sought to break the resistance that stood between them and a crown. Around midday, when the autumn's sun reached its highest point above fields already soaked with blood, the battle reached its first crucial turning point as rumors spread through the continental ranks that their commander had fallen. The momentary wavering that followed such reports created the opportunity that Harold's warriors had been waiting for, as portions of the shield wall surged forward to exploit what appeared to be enemy retreat. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the battlefield, the tactical genius that had brought William to this moment of destiny revealed itself in the calculated deception known as the feigned retreat. What appeared to be continental withdrawal was actually bait designed to lure defenders from their strong position into the open ground where cavalry could work its deadly harvest among broken formations. Victory and defeat balanced on a knife's edge as disciplined retreat drew pursuing Saxons down from their ridge into the valley, where mounted knights could strike with devastating effect. The pursuit that should have completed Harold's triumph, instead, became the trap that began his army's destruction. As warriors who had maintained formation throughout hours of assault finally broke ranks in the excitement of apparent success, the final act of the tragedy unfolded with the remorseless logic that had driven events since Edward's death nearly 10 months earlier. As defenders struggled to regain their ridge and reform the shield wall that had been their strength, a chance arrow found the gap in Harold's helmet, piercing the eye of the man who had seemed destined to preserve his kingdom's independence against all who would challenge it. With their sovereign's death, the last organized resistance to foreign conquest collapsed like a dam bursting under irresistible pressure. Warriors who had stood firm against repeated cavalry charges throughout the long day finally broke and fled, their discipline dissolved by the knowledge that the cause for which they fought had died with the man who embodied it. Across fields littered with the bodies of men who had dreamed of victory and achieved only death, William's knights pursued fleeing defenders with the systematic thoroughness that marked professional soldiers completing their victory. The kingdom that had ruled itself for centuries was passing into foreign hands with the swift finality that medieval warfare imposed upon the defeated. Night fell over Sinlac Ridge to find a new master surveying the field, where his destiny had been decided by the width of an arrow's flight and the courage of men who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance. The bastard who had crossed the sea to claim a crown now stood victorious among the dead, his right to rule written in the blood of those who had disputed it. In the gathering darkness, where torches flickered over scenes that would haunt survivors' dreams for generations, the victors began the grim work of identifying the fallen, while the defeated melted away into forests that had become the only refuge for those who would not accept foreign rule. The old world was ending as the new began, and the transformation would be written in fire and sword across a landscape that would never again know the peace of uncontested independence. From this field, where two civilizations had met in mortal combat, news would spread with the speed that only catastrophic defeat can inspire, carrying word that the Norman Conquest had begun in earnest, and that nothing would ever be the same again in the island kingdom that had fallen to the last successful invasion in its long and violent history. Victory at Hastings had eliminated organized resistance to foreign conquest, but transforming battlefield triumph into political control required the systematic submission of a kingdom whose major towns and noble families had not yet acknowledged the change of dynasty. The victor understood that crowns seized by force must be secured through careful diplomacy, backed by the constant threat of overwhelming violence. Through the smoking ruins of what had once been Harold's realm, continental forces began their methodical advance toward the capital that represented the ultimate prize of conquest. Each town that opened its gates, each noble who bent the knee, each fortress that surrendered without siege, brought the new order closer to the legitimacy that only universal acceptance could provide. At Dover, where the great fortress commanded the narrows between island and continent, the garrison made the calculation that resistance without hope of relief was merely suicide by another name. The keys to the strongest castle in the kingdom passed into foreign hands without a blow struck, opening the gateway through which reinforcements and supplies could flow from the homeland that would now rule both sides of the channel. Submission came with varying degrees of grace as the reality of the new political situation penetrated the consciousness of men who had awakened on October 14th as subjects of one ruler and found themselves by evening under the authority of another. Some yielded with the pragmatic acceptance of those who understood that successful rebellion required resources no longer available. Others bent the knee with obvious reluctance that boded ill for future stability. Archbishop Stigand, whose canonical authority had always been questionable, but whose political influence remained formidable, found himself in the impossible position of representing both the old order that had perished at Hastings and the new regime that required ecclesiastical blessing for its legitimacy. The primate's submission brought with it the theoretical approval of the church, though continental clergy would soon arrive to question both his authority and his orthodoxy. By November, the systematic nature of the conquest had become apparent to even the most optimistic resistance leaders. This was not merely a change of rulers, but a transformation of the entire political and social structure, as continental methods of governance replaced traditions that had evolved over centuries of Saxon rule. Christmas Day, 1066, dawned cold and clear over Westminster Abbey, where the greatest architectural achievement of the previous reign would witness the coronation that would legitimize conquest and begin the process of transforming a foreign invasion into a native dynasty. The ceremony itself proceeded with all the ancient solemnity that tradition required, yet everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in the long history of the realm. Within Westminster's soaring arches, where Edward the Confessor had been buried less than a year earlier, William received the crown that Harold had worn for less than 10 months. The sacred oils that anointed the new sovereign carried the same divine authority that had blessed previous rulers, yet the armed guards who surrounded the altar spoke to the reality that this legitimacy rested ultimately upon the sword rather than popular acceptance. Edgar Atheling, the young prince whose royal blood made him the closest thing to a legitimate heir that the old dynasty could produce, had already submitted to the inevitable with the wisdom of youth that understands survival requires accommodation to circumstances beyond any individual's control. His presence at the coronation provided a symbolic bridge between old and new, though few believed such bridges would bear much weight in the trials ahead. As 1066 drew to its close, the speed and completeness of the transformation amazed even those who had participated in its achievement. A kingdom that had seemed impregnable behind its wooden walls and ancient traditions had fallen to foreign conquest in less than 3 months, its capital occupied, its nobility scattered or subdued, its crown passing to a bastard whose only claim was the strength of his sword arm and the favor of fortune. Yet beneath the surface of apparent submission, currents of resistance continued to flow like underground streams, fed by the resentment of those who had lost everything in the great upheaval and the hope of those who believed that foreign rule could not long endure among a people who had governed themselves for centuries. The easy victories of the conquest period would give way to the harder work of establishing permanent control over subjects who yielded from necessity rather than conviction. In London's ancient halls, where Saxon Witan had deliberated for generations, continental administrators began the complex task of understanding the systems they had inherited and adapting them to the needs of rulers whose experience lay in very different traditions of governance. The merger of Norman efficiency with Saxon custom would produce innovations in law and administration, but not without considerable friction between conqueror and conquered. The treasure that Edward the Confessor had accumulated through decades of careful stewardship now passed into foreign hands, providing the financial resources necessary to reward the adventurers who had risked everything on the great gamble of invasion. Gold and silver that had been gathered to glorify God through magnificent architecture and beautiful manuscripts would now serve the more mundane purpose of purchasing loyalty among men whose primary devotion was to their own advancement. Winchester, the ancient seat of Saxon royalty, surrendered with the resigned dignity of a dowager acknowledging her replacement by a younger rival. The city that had been the heart of the Old Kingdom became merely another administrative centre in a realm whose focus had shifted irrevocably toward the continent and the broader European stage where its new ruler was already a major player. Canterbury's submission brought with it control of the most important archbishopric in the realm, though the question of legitimate ecclesiastical authority would remain contentious as continental clergy challenged the canonical status of those who had served the previous regime. The transformation of the church would parallel the transformation of secular government, with similar tensions between old and new, native and foreign. From the ramparts of Dover Castle, where continental banners now flew above walls that had never before acknowledged foreign sovereignty, observers could look across the narrow waters toward the homeland that would now provide the kingdom with its rulers, its laws, and its cultural orientation. The isolation that had protected the realm for centuries had ended forever, and the island kingdom had become part of a broader continental empire whose centre lay across the sea, in the duchy that had produced its conqueror. As winter settled over a transformed landscape, where continental accents could be heard in halls that had echoed for centuries with Saxon speech, the magnitude of the change that had occurred in a single year became apparent to those who lived through it. The conquest was complete, the crown secure, and the long process of building a new order from the ruins of the old was about to begin in earnest. Conquest and coronation had provided the ceremonial foundation of the new dynasty, but transforming a reluctant kingdom into a secure realm required years of patient violence that would test both the conqueror's resources and his subjects' capacity for resistance. The easy victories of 1066 gave way to the grinding work of suppressing a people who discovered that Norman rule meant not merely new masters, but the systematic destruction of everything they had considered permanent. In the spring of 1067, confident that his crown was secure and his major enemies defeated, the new ruler made the decision that would trigger the most serious challenges to his authority since Hastings. His return to the homeland that had made conquest possible left the newly won kingdom under the control of regents whose authority rested solely upon Norman bayonets, and whose understanding of local customs remained dangerously incomplete. Rebellion erupted first in Kent, where Eustace of Boulogne led a desperate assault on Dover Castle that failed only because Norman garrison commanders had learned to expect such attempts and prepared accordingly. The attack's failure demonstrated both the continuing appeal of resistance and the military superiority that kept the new regime secure, despite its obvious unpopularity among the conquered population. Throughout 1068, the systematic nature of native resistance became apparent as uprisings spread from the southwestern peninsula to the northern borders, each rebellion carefully timed to exploit the regime's apparent weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation with its overwhelming strengths. The conquered had learned from Hastings that victory required different tactics than those that had served Saxon armies in previous generations. Northern resistance proved particularly dangerous because it combined local grievances with external support from Scandinavian rulers who saw opportunity in the chaos that foreign conquest had created. When Danish fleets appeared in Yorkshire waters, they found willing allies among populations that remembered when Viking rule had meant partnership rather than subjugation, and whose hatred of continental domination made any alternative seem preferable. When Danish invasion forces landed in the Humber and marched on York, they carried with them the hopes of everyone who believed that the conquest might yet be reversed through a combination of external pressure and internal uprising. The fall of the northern capital to this alliance of Scandinavian ambition and Saxon desperation sent shockwaves through the Norman administration that had grown complacent about the security of their conquest. At Ely, in the marshlands where geography provided natural fortification against cavalry charges, Hereward, the Wake established a base of operations that would become legendary as the last stronghold of truly independent resistance to the new regime. The Isles Monastery provided both spiritual justification and practical resources for a rebellion that attracted the desperate and the idealistic in equal measure. During the terrible winter of 1069-70, the response to Northern rebellion took the form of systematic destruction that would be remembered for generations as evidence of Norman ruthlessness. The harrying of the North transformed prosperous regions into wasteland as William's forces applied the calculated brutality that medieval warfare reserved for populations that refused to accept the inevitable. By 1071, when the last organized resistance finally collapsed and Hereward himself disappeared into the legends that would outlive the men who created them, the price of conquest had been paid by both conqueror and conquered. The kingdom that emerged from these years of violence was fundamentally different from what had existed before. Its population reduced, its economy disrupted, its social structure transformed by the demands of permanent military occupation. Administrative reforms that accompanied military pacification created the most efficient government in medieval Europe, as Norman methods of record-keeping and taxation replaced the informal systems that had served Saxon rulers for centuries. The Domesday Survey that would follow represented the culmination of this process, creating a comprehensive record of resources that no previous government had possessed. Castle building that proceeded systematically throughout the kingdom provided both military strongpoints and visible symbols of the new order, their stone towers rising above Saxon settlements like monuments to the permanence of Norman rule. From these fortifications, the duke's garrisons could dominate surrounding countryside, while demonstrating to potential rebels the futility of resistance against such overwhelming military superiority. The redistribution of land that followed successful pacification created a new nobility whose loyalty to the crown rested upon self-interest rather than tradition, as Norman adventurers who had risked everything on the great gamble of conquest found themselves rewarded with estates confiscated from the defeated. This transformation of the landed classes would prove more lasting than any military victory. Legal innovations that merged Norman practice with Saxon custom produced a hybrid system that satisfied neither tradition completely, but provided more effective governance than either could offer alone. The common law that would emerge from this fusion would become one of the conquest's most enduring legacies, though its creators could hardly have foreseen its ultimate significance. Economic changes that accompanied political transformation integrated the island kingdom into Norman trading networks, while disrupting traditional patterns of production and exchange. Towns that had prospered under Saxon rule found themselves either elevated or abandoned, depending upon their strategic value, to rulers whose priorities reflected ducal rather than insular concerns. Religious reforms that brought Norman clergy to replace Saxon ecclesiastics completed the transformation by ensuring that spiritual authority reinforced rather than challenged the new political order. The appointment of Norman abbots and bishops created a church hierarchy whose loyalty was beyond question, though at the cost of alienating populations who had found comfort in native traditions. Cultural changes that followed in the wake of political conquest were perhaps most profound of all, as Norman languages and customs gradually displaced Saxon traditions among the ruling classes, while leaving the common people to preserve what they could of the old ways in private. The linguistic division that resulted would influence the development of the realm's literature and law for centuries. Resistance that continued despite military defeat took new forms as open rebellion became impossible, expressing itself through passive non-cooperation, cultural preservation, and the development of an underground tradition that kept alive the memory of what had been lost. The conquered learned to survive under the new regime while maintaining their identity through subtler means than armed resistance. Military innovations that William's commanders introduced transformed both the practice of warfare and the structure of society, as feudal obligations replaced the ancient fyrd system and professional knights became the backbone of the realm's defenses. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, few could remember how Saxon armies had once been organized or equipped. As the first phase of Norman rule drew to its close, the kingdom that had fallen so suddenly at Hastings had been rebuilt according to ducal specifications, its resistance broken, its population subdued, and its future irrevocably linked to the broader European world from which its conquerors had come. The old order was dead, and from its ashes, had risen something entirely new. Cultural synthesis that emerged from the collision between continental and native civilizations produced innovations in literature, law, and learning that neither tradition could have achieved independently. The historical writing that flourished under royal patronage, the legal precedents that were established in royal courts, and the architectural styles that were developed by continental builders all represented genuine advances that justified invasion through achievement rather than mere force. Economic prosperity that followed political stability brought wealth to regions that had been devastated by the chaos of war and consolidation. Trade that had been disrupted by warfare resumed on a scale that exceeded anything the native kingdom had known, while agricultural production recovered and expanded under the systematic management that continental landlords imposed upon their newly acquired estates. 20 years after the arrows fell at Hastings, the kingdom that had emerged from invasion bore little resemblance to the realm that Harold had died defending. Where Saxon thanes had once dispensed rough justice in timber halls, continental barons now ruled from stone castles that rose like mountains of carved authority above settlements whose very names were being transformed by the linguistic revolution that accompanied political transformation. Under William's methodical governance, what had begun as military occupation evolved into the most sophisticated administrative system in medieval Europe. The conqueror's genius lay not merely in his ability to win battles, but in his systematic approach to consolidating victory through institutions that would outlast any individual ruler and bind the conquered population to their new masters through bonds stronger than simple force. Castle construction that proceeded with relentless efficiency throughout the conquered territories created a network of fortified strongpoints that served simultaneously as military bases, administrative centers, and symbols of the permanent nature of the transformation that had occurred. From Warwick to Durham, from Exeter to Chester, stone towers proclaimed in a language that needed no translation that the old order had passed away forever. Economic transformation that accompanied political change integrated the island kingdom into trading networks that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, bringing unprecedented prosperity to regions that embraced the new opportunities, while devastating those that clung too desperately to obsolete traditions. Merchants who learned to navigate the complex relationships between continental overlords and native craftsmen often found riches that their grandfathers could never have imagined. Legal reforms that merged the best elements of continental jurisprudence with local customary law created a hybrid system that would become the foundation of common law throughout the English-speaking world. The conqueror's courts dispensed justice with an efficiency and consistency that gradually won acceptance even among populations that had initially resented any deviation from ancestral practices. Religious changes that brought continental monasticism and cathedral building transformed the spiritual landscape as thoroughly as political upheaval had transformed the secular realm. Where native churches had served local communities with ancient simplicity, continental cathedrals soared toward heaven with architectural ambitions that proclaimed the glory of God and the power of those who served him on earth. Cultural integration proceeded with the inexorable patience of geological change, as continental French gradually became the language of government and high culture, while the native tongue survived among the common people, who maintained their ancestral language in field and workshop. The linguistic division that resulted would enrich the conquered language with thousands of words borrowed from its conquerors, creating a hybrid tongue of unprecedented expressiveness. As death approached in the autumn of 1087, the conqueror could survey achievements that had transformed not merely a kingdom, but the entire balance of power in northwestern Europe. The bastard who had gambled everything on a single invasion had created a cross-channel empire that would influence European politics for centuries, while establishing institutions that would shape the development of law, government, and culture throughout the medieval world. In September of that final year, as William lay dying in Rouen from injuries sustained in a campaign that had begun like so many others, but ended in unexpected catastrophe, the question of succession that had driven him to conquest 21 years earlier now haunted his own dynasty. The three sons who gathered around his deathbed represented different aspects of his complex legacy. Robert Curthose inherited the duchy that had made conquest possible. William Rufus received the kingdom that conquest had won, while young Henry waited with the patience that would eventually bring him both. Thus ended the life of the man who had changed the course of medieval history through a combination of ruthless ambition, tactical brilliance, and administrative genius that medieval chroniclers would struggle to capture in mere words. The invasion was complete, its architect departing a world that his vision had transformed beyond recognition, leaving behind institutions and innovations that would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries to come. The Domesday Survey, that stands as perhaps the Conqueror's most enduring monument to systematic governance, had been completed just months before his death, creating a record of resources and obligations that represented the culmination of 20 years spent transforming a conquered territory into an efficiently administered realm. No medieval government had ever possessed such detailed knowledge of its subjects' wealth and capabilities, and none would again until the development of modern statistical methods. Land redistribution that had begun immediately after Hastings reached its logical conclusion in the final years of the reign, as the last native estates passed into continental hands and the transformation of the landed classes was completed. Where once native earls had ruled territories that resembled independent principalities, continental barons now held their estates as tenants-in-chief, whose obligations to the crown were precisely defined and ruthlessly enforced. Administrative innovations that had evolved from the practical necessities of governing a hostile population matured into sophisticated systems of record-keeping, taxation, and law enforcement that would be copied throughout medieval Europe. The exchequer that managed royal finances, the chancery that issued royal documents, and the courts that dispensed royal justice all represented advances in governmental efficiency that reflected the conqueror's talent for transforming military victory into lasting political achievement. Military organization that had made victory possible was refined into a feudal system that provided the crown with more reliable military service than any previous monarch had enjoyed. The knight service obligations that continental landholders owed in exchange for their estates created a professional military class whose loyalty was reinforced by self-interest and whose effectiveness had been proven in the crucible of war and consolidation. Social transformation that accompanied political change created a new hierarchy that blended continental concepts of feudal obligation with native traditions of personal loyalty, producing a social order that was more rigid in theory than in practice, and more stable than either of its component traditions might have achieved alone. The intermarriage between continental settlers and local natives that gradually occurred, despite initial hostility, created a genuinely integrated nobility within 2 generations of invasion. Architectural achievements that marked the conqueror's reign transformed the physical appearance of the kingdom as thoroughly as political change had transformed its governance. The great cathedrals that rose at Durham and Winchester, the massive keeps that dominated London and Colchester, and the hundreds of parish churches that were rebuilt in the continental style, all testified to the permanence of the transformation that had occurred and the confidence of those who had accomplished it. Cultural synthesis that emerged from the collision between continental and native civilizations produced innovations in literature, law, and learning that neither tradition could have achieved independently. The historical writing that flourished under royal patronage, the legal precedents that were established in royal courts, and the architectural styles that were developed by continental builders all represented genuine advances that justified invasion through achievement rather than mere force. Economic prosperity that followed political stability brought wealth to regions that had been devastated by the chaos of war and consolidation. Trade that had been disrupted by warfare resumed on a scale that exceeded anything the native kingdom had known, while agricultural production recovered and expanded under the systematic management that continental landlords imposed upon their newly acquired estates. The legacy that the conqueror bequeathed to his successors and to history was thus far more complex and enduring than the simple substitution of one ruling dynasty for another. The invasion had created new forms of government, new approaches to law and justice, new architectural styles, and new cultural syntheses that would influence the development of Western civilization long after the political circumstances that had made them possible were forgotten. The bastard duke who had won a crown through war had transformed himself into one of the great constructive statesmen of the medieval world,